The lilies smelled cloying, suffocating, just like the grief. I stood beside Mom, trying to look strong, trying not to crumble. My stepdad, David, was gone. Heart attack. Just like that. Gone. He hadn't been my biological father, but he'd been my dad. Since I was 7, he taught me to ride a bike, how to change a tire, how to tell a good joke. He was steady, reliable. And now, this. Mom was a mess. Red-eyed, shaking, clinging to my arm like I was the only thing keeping her from falling into a bottomless pit. I wanted to be strong for her, but the truth was, I was barely holding myself together. I was 18, freshly graduated, supposed to be looking forward to college. Instead, I was staring into a freshly dug grave. And then there was him. Mark, Mom's boyfriend. He stood a few feet away, his expression. I couldn't read it. Too smooth, too controlled. He was tall, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes that always seemed to be assessing something. I'd never liked him. Something about him made my skin crawl. He hadn't been around for long, maybe 6 months. Mom had met him at a local bar. He was charming, I guess. He bought her drinks, told her she was beautiful, listened to her. Things David hadn't done enough of lately, but there was something off. He was too attentive, too eager to please. And his eyes, they lingered. They lingered on me sometimes, too. After the service, at the reception at our house, he came up to me. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Sarah," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He put a hand on my shoulder. I flinched. "Thanks," I mumbled, pulling away. "Your mom's going to need you now more than ever." He looked around the room, then leaned closer. "She's vulnerable. Vulnerable." That was one word for it. Devastated was another. "I'll be there for her," I said, trying to sound confident. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Of course!" But sometimes a woman needs a man's strength. I just stared at him, a knot forming in my stomach. He squeezed my shoulder again, then walked away. That was the beginning of the unraveling. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, lawyers, and the constant aching absence of David. Mom was barely functioning. She spent most of her time in bed, staring at the ceiling. I cooked, cleaned, and tried to handle as much of the legal stuff as I could. David had been a good provider. He owned a small construction company, nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. He'd also had a life insurance policy, a substantial one, enough to secure Mom's future, maybe even help me with college. Then the will came. I sat with Mom in the lawyer's office, Mr. Henderson, a kind, older man with a gentle voice. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. Everything was standard, or so I thought. The house, the company, the savings account, all to Mom. And then came the life insurance. And the beneficiary of Mr. Miller's life insurance policy is Mr. Henderson paused, looking at Mom over his glasses. "Miss Susan Davies and Mr. Mark Harding to be split equally." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. "Mark? Mark Harding?" David had only known him for 6 months. Mom gasped. "There must be some mistake," she stammered. "Mark? Why would David leave half of his life insurance to Mark?" Mr. Henderson checked the document again. "I assure you, Mrs. Davies, this is what the will states. It was signed and witnessed just 3 months ago. 3 months. That meant David had changed his will after Mark came into the picture. Why? Mom was a wreck. She insisted it was a mistake, that David would never do that to her. But the will was clear. Half of the life insurance money was going to Mark. Later that night, after Mom had finally drifted off to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table, replaying the scene in my head. Something wasn't right. David wouldn't have done this. He loved Mom. He wouldn't have left her like this. I decided to do some digging. The next day, while Mom was still sleeping, I went to David's office. It was a small, cluttered space above the construction site, filled with blueprints, invoices, and the lingering scent of sawdust. I started going through his files, looking for anything that might explain the change in the will. I found old insurance documents, bank statements, contracts, nothing that seemed relevant. Then, in a dusty corner, hidden behind a stack of blueprints, I found a small, locked metal box. My heart started to race. What was inside? I tried to open it, but it was securely locked. I searched the office for a key, but I couldn't find one. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I spotted a small toolbox on a shelf. Inside, I found a set of lockpicks. David had always been a bit of a handyman. I'd never picked a lock before, but I figured it was worth a try. After a few tense minutes of fumbling with the tools, I heard a faint click. The box opened. Inside, there were several things: a stack of photos, a small notebook, and a USB drive. The photos were of Mom and David, happy and smiling, from years ago. They made my heart ache. The notebook was filled with David's handwriting, mostly notes about work, appointments, and grocery lists, but it was the USB drive that caught my attention. What was on it? I rushed back to the house and plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained several files, financial documents, scanned copies of legal papers, and a single video file. I clicked on the video. It was David. He was sitting at his desk, looking directly at the camera. He looked tired, his eyes filled with worry. "If you're watching this," he began, his voice raspy, "it means something has happened to me." My breath caught in my throat. "I don't have much time," he continued. "I've discovered something about Mark, something that Mom can't know." "Not yet." He paused, took a deep breath. "Mark isn't who he says he is. He's after something. I don't know what, but I'm afraid for Susan. I'm afraid for Sarah." He looked directly at the camera, his eyes pleading. "I've gathered evidence. It's all on this drive. Please, someone, protect them." The video ended. I sat there, frozen, the blood draining from my face. David had known. He'd known Mark was dangerous. And now he was dead. And Mark had half of his life insurance money. The implications of the video were staggering. David hadn't just died. He'd been investigating Mark. He'd been afraid. I had to tell Mom. But how? She was so fragile, so broken. The truth could shatter her completely. But I couldn't keep it from her. She deserved to know. I waited until the next morning, after she'd had a decent night's sleep. I made her breakfast, toast, and tea, and sat with her at the kitchen table. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "I found something important." I told her about the locked box, the USB drive, the video. I watched her face as I spoke, her eyes widening in disbelief, then clouding with pain. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, staring blankly at her teacup. "No," she whispered finally. "No, it can't be true. Mark wouldn't. He wouldn't do that." "Mom, David was afraid of him. He said Mark was after something. But the will. Why would David leave him half the money? That was the question I couldn't answer. Unless, Mom, maybe Mark manipulated him. Maybe he tricked him somehow." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to believe anymore." I reached across the table and took her hand. "I know this is hard, Mom, but we have to be strong. We have to find out the truth." She nodded slowly, her grip tightening on my hand. "What do we do?" "First, we need to look at the evidence on the USB drive. See what David found out about Mark." We spent the rest of the day poring over the files on the drive. There were bank records showing large sums of money being transferred to offshore accounts. There were scanned copies of documents with forged signatures. There were emails between Mark and someone named the Collector, discussing a valuable asset that David possessed. It was all circumstantial, but it painted a disturbing picture. Mark was involved in something shady, something dangerous, and David had gotten too close. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the video in my head. David's fear, his plea for help. I felt a burning rage building inside me. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and let Mark get away with this. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to confront Mark. I found him at the construction site, talking to one of David's foremen. He saw me approaching and his face tightened. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" "I want to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "About what?" "About David. About the will. About everything." He sighed. "Look, I know this is a difficult time for you, but I don't think. I know about the offshore accounts," Mark one interrupted. "I know about the emails. I know David was investigating you." His eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. David knew you were up to something. And now he's dead." He took a step closer to me, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You should be careful what you say, Sarah. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I retorted. "A con man. A thief. Maybe even a murderer." He grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "You're out of line," he hissed. I tried to pull away, but he held on tight. I could feel my anger rising, threatening to explode. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't release me. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath hot on my face. "David was a fool," he said. "He got in the way. And now he's gone. You should learn from his mistake." That was it. Something snapped inside me. I kneed him in the groin, hard. He doubled over in pain, releasing my arm. I took the opportunity to run. I didn't stop running until I reached the house. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I'd made a mistake. I'd confronted him too soon. Now he knew I was onto him, and he wouldn't hesitate to silence me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent shivers down my spine. I kept imagining Mark lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance. I checked all the locks, closed all the curtains, and armed the security system. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mom was a wreck. She kept crying, saying it was all her fault, that she'd brought Mark into our lives. I tried to reassure her, but I was scared too. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise. A faint, scratching sound coming from downstairs. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed and crept to the door. I listened at the door for a moment, trying to discern the source of the noise. It was definitely coming from downstairs. Slowly, cautiously, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark and silent, except for the faint scratching sound. I made my way down the stairs, holding the bat in front of me. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. The back door was open. A cold gust of wind swept through the house, sending the curtains fluttering. I could see the silhouette of someone standing in the doorway. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless. I raised the bat, ready to strike. "I'm warning you," I said. "I have a weapon." The figure took a step forward, and I recognized him. It was Mark. He stepped inside the house, closing the door behind him. He was holding something in his hand, something metallic and glinting in the moonlight. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" He smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "I want what's mine." He lunged at me. I swung the bat, hitting him in the shoulder. He staggered back, but quickly recovered. He raised his weapon. It was a knife. I screamed and ran, dodging his attack. He chased me through the house, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. I ran into the living room, knocking over furniture in my panic. I stumbled and fell, hitting my head on the edge of the coffee table. I lay there, dazed, as Mark approached me. He stood over me, the knife raised high. "This is the end, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with hatred. Just then, Mom appeared in the doorway, holding a fire poker. "Get away from her!" she screamed and charged at Mark. She swung the poker, hitting him in the head. He cried out in pain and stumbled backward. I used the opportunity to get to my feet. I grabbed a lamp and threw it at Mark. It shattered against the wall, showering him with glass. He was disoriented, giving us a chance to escape. Mom and I ran out of the house, into the night. We didn't stop running until we reached our neighbor's house. We banged on the door, screaming for help. The neighbors called the police. When the police arrived, they found Mark unconscious inside our house. He was arrested and taken into custody. We were safe. For now. The arrest of Mark Harding was a relief, but it didn't solve everything. He was just a pawn, a tool used by someone else. The emails on the USB drive had mentioned the collector, and I knew he was the one pulling the strings. I told the police everything I knew about the offshore accounts, the forged documents, the emails. They promised to investigate, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. They saw me as a grieving teenager, obsessed with proving her stepdad was murdered. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started by trying to track down the collector. The emails on the USB drive were encrypted, but I managed to find some IP addresses. I traced them to a series of burner phones and anonymous internet cafes. It was a dead end. Then I remembered something David had said in the video. He'd mentioned a valuable asset that he possessed. What was it? I searched through David's office again, looking for anything that might be considered valuable. I found his tools, his equipment, his financial records. Nothing seemed to fit. Then I remembered something Mom had told me. David had been working on a special project before he died. A custom-built house for a wealthy client. Could that be the valuable asset? I decided to visit the construction site. The house was located on a remote piece of land outside of town. It was still under construction, but it was already impressive. A modern, glass and steel structure overlooking a stunning view of the mountains. I spoke to the foreman, a gruff, middle-aged man named Frank. He told me David had been obsessed with the house, spending every spare moment on it. He said it was the most important project he'd ever worked on, Frank said. He was really proud of it. I asked Frank if he knew anything about the client, the person who was having the house built. He said he'd never met them, that David had handled all the communication. He said they were very private, Frank said. Didn't want anyone knowing who they were. That raised a red flag. Why would someone want to keep their identity a secret? I asked Frank if I could look around the house. He agreed, but warned me to be careful. The site was still under construction and there were hazards everywhere. I spent hours exploring the house, searching for any clue, any hint of what David might have been hiding. I checked every room, every closet, every nook and cranny. I found nothing. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I noticed something odd about the fireplace in the living room. It was made of stone, but one of the stones seemed slightly out of place. I reached out and touched it. It felt loose. I pulled on the stone, and it came away from the wall, revealing a small opening. Inside the opening, I found a metal box. My heart started to race. This had to be it. I opened the box. Inside, there was a single object, a small, antique music box. It was beautifully crafted, made of polished wood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It looked expensive, but it didn't seem valuable enough to be the asset David had mentioned. I opened the music box. A delicate melody filled the air, a haunting tune that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As the music played, I noticed something else. The lid of the music box was lined with tiny gears and springs. It was a mechanism of some kind. I examined the mechanism closely. It looked like it was designed to open something. But what? Then I realized the music box itself was the key. I looked around the room, searching for something the music box might open. My eyes fell on the fireplace, the stone I had removed. I took the music box and placed it inside the opening in the fireplace. It fit perfectly. I turned the music box and the mechanism clicked into place. The gears whirred and the wall behind the fireplace began to slide open, revealing a hidden room. I stepped inside the room. It was small and bare, with concrete walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room, there was a table. On the table, there was a single object, a laptop computer. I rushed to the laptop and opened it. It was password protected. I tried several passwords, but none of them worked. I was about to give up when I remembered something David had always said. Think like the person who created it. I thought about David. What was important to him? What would he use as a password? Then it hit me. His favorite song. The song the music box played. I typed the name of the song into the password field. The laptop unlocked. On the screen, there was a single file, the truth. I opened the file. It was a document detailing the history of the land the house was built on. The land had once belonged to a wealthy family who had made their fortune in the diamond trade. According to the document, the family had hidden a fortune in diamonds somewhere on the property, a fortune that had never been found. David had discovered the hidden diamonds. He had been building the house as a cover to search for them, and the collector knew. He wanted the diamonds, and he was willing to do anything to get them. I knew I was in danger. The collector was out there, and he knew I was close to finding the diamonds. He wouldn't hesitate to kill me to get what he wanted. I had to go to the police. I rushed back to town and went straight to the police station. I told them everything I had discovered about the hidden room, the laptop, the diamonds. They still didn't believe me. They said it was a wild goose chase, a fantasy fueled by grief. Look, Miss Davies, the detective said, I understand you're upset, but we can't waste our resources on this. We have real crimes to solve. I was furious. They were dismissing me, ignoring the danger I was in. Fine, I said. I'll find the diamonds myself. And when I do, you'll be sorry you didn't listen to me. I stormed out of the police station, determined to prove them wrong. I knew the collector was watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, lurking in the shadows. I had to be careful. I decided to set a trap. I went back to the construction site and waited. I knew the collector would come eventually. He couldn't let me find the diamonds. As darkness fell, I heard a noise. A car pulling up to the construction site. I hid in the shadows, watching as a figure emerged from the car. He was tall and imposing, dressed in a dark suit. It was the collector. He walked towards the house, his face hidden in the shadows. He carried a gun. I waited until he was inside the house. Then I made my move. I crept up to the house and slipped inside. I moved silently through the darkness, stalking the collector. I found him in the living room, standing in front of the fireplace. He was examining the hidden room, his eyes gleaming with greed. Looking for something? I said, my voice echoing in the silence. He turned around, startled. He raised his gun. You, he said, his voice cold and menacing. I should have known you'd be here. I know about the diamonds, I said. I know you killed David for them. He laughed. David was a fool. He got in my way, and now you're going to pay the price. He aimed the gun at me. I didn't flinch. I knew I was going to die, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. I lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. We wrestled on the floor, fighting for control of the weapon. He was stronger than me, but I was faster. I managed to grab the gun and point it at him. Don't move, I said, my voice shaking. He froze. I'm calling the police, I said. He sneered. You won't get away with this. I dialed 911. As I waited for the police to arrive, the collector told me everything. He confessed to everything, to manipulating Mark, to killing David. He was a monster. When the police arrived, they took the collector into custody. They finally believed me. With the collector behind bars, the case was finally closed. David's murder was solved. I had avenged his death. But there was still one thing left to do, find the diamonds. I knew they were hidden somewhere on the property. David had been searching for them when he died. I spent days scouring the land, searching for any clue, any sign of where the diamonds might be hidden. I searched the woods, the fields, the creek. I found nothing. I was about to give up when I remembered something Frank, the foreman, had told me. David had been obsessed with the view from the house. He had spent hours looking at the mountains. Could the view be the key? I went back to the house and stood in the living room, looking out the window. The view was breathtaking. The mountains stretched out before me, their peaks covered in snow. I studied the mountains, looking for any landmark, any distinguishing feature. Then I saw it, a small, oddly shaped rock formation on one of the peaks. It looked like a hand pointing towards the sky. I grabbed a map of the area and located the rock formation. It was near a hiking trail. I decided to hike to the rock formation. It was a long and difficult hike, but I was determined to find the diamonds. After hours of climbing, I finally reached the rock formation. It was even more impressive up close. A massive wall of stone jutting out from the side of the mountain. I searched the area around the rock formation, looking for any sign of where the diamonds might be hidden. I found nothing. Then I noticed something odd about the rock formation itself. There was a small crack in the stone, barely visible. I reached out and touched the crack. It felt loose. I pulled on the stone, and it came away from the rock formation, revealing a small opening. Inside the opening, I found a metal box. My heart started to race. This had to be it. I opened the box. Inside, there was a velvet pouch. I opened the pouch. Inside, there were dozens of diamonds. They sparkled in the sunlight, blindingly beautiful. They were worth millions. I had found them. Finding the diamonds was a bittersweet victory. I had avenged David's death and found a fortune, but I would have given it all back to have him back. I turned the diamonds over to the police. They were able to trace them back to the wealthy family who had hidden them on the property. The family was overjoyed to have them back. They offered me a reward, a small percentage of the value of the diamonds. I refused. I didn't want their money. I used the money from David's life insurance policy, the half that wasn't stolen by Mark, to pay for my college education. I studied criminal justice, determined to make sure no one else had to go through what I went through. Mom slowly began to heal. She started seeing a therapist, and she eventually found love again. She deserved to be happy. Mark Harding was convicted of fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The collector was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Justice was served. I never forgot David. He was always in my heart. He was the father I had chosen, and I would always be grateful for the time we had together. I learned a lot from my experience. I learned about greed, about betrayal, about the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. But I also learned about courage, about resilience, about the power of love. And I learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. Years later, I stood in my office, a successful lawyer, fighting for justice for victims of crime. I was helping others, giving them a voice. On my desk, there was a small, antique music box. It was the music box that had unlocked the hidden room, the music box that had led me to the truth. I opened the music box. The delicate melody filled the air, a haunting tune that reminded me of David. I closed my eyes and smiled. He was gone, but he would never be forgotten, and I would never stop fighting for justice.